My name is Gusta Johnson, and I am proud to work at the Carnegie Council. The Council has been the voice for ethics in international affairs for nearly a century, but we need your help. To guarantee the future of programs like this one, please give generously to the Council's fund drive. Visit carnegiecouncil.org and click on Donate/Join. Thank you.
What's the difference in the overall pattern of political development? China, as I said, develops a modern state very, very early on in its history, but it never develops rule of law. China is the only world civilization that does not have rule of law, in my sense, because it never has a transcendental religion. So the Chinese always, proclaim law, but it's always a positive law. It's always a proclamation of the emperor. There's never a concept in China that the law is something higher than the state that should restrict what the state itself is able to do. And having established this very powerful state, they can then prevent the formation of groups that would be opposed to it, like an independent bourgeoisie in cities, or a blood nobility, or a religious establishment. And so the fact that they go after Falun Gong today follows in a long, very consistent line of opposition to the formation of any civil society, source of authority that they don't control. And so you get just the state with no accountability and no rule of law. In the West, the sequence was actually, it's oftentimes misunderstood because it begins with rule of law, then moves to the development of a strong state, and only at the end do you get institutions of accountability. So that the very process of state formation in early modern Europe is done against the background of law. There's this contrast I make in the book. My favorite character in Chinese history is the evil Empress Wu, who lived early in the 6th century. She was the only woman in Chinese dynastic history to ever establish a dynasty under her own name, as opposed to being a regent for a son or a husband. She did this in this extraordinarily ruthless way. She was the concubine of the second Tang emperor. She arranged to have her own young daughter brought into the empress's presence and then smothered, and then the crime was blamed on the empress, who was subsequently then dethroned and then, a few years later cut up and stuffed in a wine vat somewhere. And this consort Wu then became the empress. She killed one of her own sons, she sequestered another one, and she actually managed to kill off a substantial part of the Tang nobility that had opposed her rise to power by the end of the 6th century. And so, the kind of internal power struggles among the elite in China were really not restricted by legal restraints on what people with political power could do to other elites. In Europe, by contrast, there are two big revolts, famous revolts. One was the Comunero revolt against the great Habsburg Emperor Charles V in the 1520s. The other one was this uprising known as the Fronde in France against Louis XIV. Both of these are anti-monarchical revolts by elites, by aristocrats. They lose the war, and at the end, both of the kings pardon their noble rivals. If this had been a Chinese emperor, they would have been executed, their whole lineages would have been killed off to break the rope of descent. But in Europe, there were constraints. Up until the great totalitarian upheavals of the 20th century, there were very powerful constraints on what people could do in the exercise of power that I think sets up the present, all right? So this is the question we have to ask going forward into the future. The Chinese have this extremely efficient, authoritarian, high-quality authoritarian centralized system, no checks and balances. So if they want to do a stimulus plan or infrastructure investment, they just go ahead and do it. We, on the other hand, have an institution that has a state, but it has lots of checks and balances. And right now, we are very checked and balanced. And in fact, we're so checked and balanced because of, I think, a rather dysfunctional political culture that we can't actually make decisions on impending problems that everybody can see rising ahead of them. Healthcare costs, the deficit, the basic unsustainability of the current course that we're on. But the political system, because it emphasizes kind of constraints on the exercise of power, isn't able to get through the decisions that we have to make. And so the real question is, in the future, which of these systems is going to be more sustainable as we go forward?